The candle had burned down to nothing by the time I arrived. I noticed it the moment I stepped through the servants' entrance of Castlemark. That single iron candle holder on the narrow stone shelf beside the door, its wick a curl of black ash, the wax pooled and cold. Someone had forgotten to replace it. And somehow, in that first breath of the place that would now be my home, that small neglect felt like a message meant for me alone. You do not belong here either. You too will be used up and forgotten. I pressed the thought down before it could take root. My name is Nora. I am 23 years of age, the youngest daughter of a village healer from the lowland settlement of Ashfen, and I had walked 4 days to reach the capital with nothing but a wool sack on my back and a letter of recommendation scratched out by the village elder, a man who owed my late father a favor, and had decided, apparently, that sending me away was repayment enough. The castle smelled of tallow and damp stone and something else beneath both. Pine resin, I thought, or perhaps the smoke of a very old hearth. The corridors near the servants' wing were narrow, the ceiling low and arched, the torches spaced so far apart that shadows pooled between them like standing water. I followed the head housekeeper, a stout woman named Marta, who had not once looked back at me since we passed the gate. "You will address every member of the noble household as my lord, or my lady," she said, her voice carrying the practiced flatness of someone who had given this speech a great many times. "You will not speak unless spoken to in the great hall. You will not meet the eyes of the Alpha King or any member of his council. If you are in a corridor and a ranking Alpha enters, you press yourself to the wall and look at the floor until they pass. Yes, Marta, you will rise before the first bell, and you will not retire until the kitchens are cold. Your duties will include the Upper East Corridor, the council anteroom, and whatever the senior maids assign you as surplus." Surplus. That was one word for it. I had known, coming here, that I would be at the bottom. Omegas always were. In Ashfen, it had been gentler. My father's standing as healer had given our family a kind of borrowed dignity, a buffer between us and the full weight of what our designation meant in the hierarchy. But my father was gone now, and the buffer with him, and I was what I had always been beneath the borrowed grace. An Omega girl with a wool sack, and a letter from a man who wanted to be rid of his debt. Marta stopped abruptly before a heavy oak door and pushed it open without ceremony. Inside, 4 other women looked up from their pallets, 2 already in sleep clothes, one mending something by candlelight, one simply staring at the ceiling. "This is the new girl, Nora from Ashfen. She takes the empty pallet by the window." Marta's gaze swept the room once, appraising. "See that she knows the morning routine before the first bell." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a sound like a verdict. Silence. The woman mending looked at me first. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with a long face and careful eyes. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. "You look like you've walked half the kingdom." 4 days, I admitted, sinking onto the edge of the indicated pallet. The straw inside it rustled dryly. 4 days. She let out a slow breath through her nose. "I'm Sarah. The one staring at heaven is Diel. She does that. Don't worry about it. The 2 already sleeping are twins, Bryn and Mel. They won't speak to you tonight, but they're harmless enough by morning." "Thank you." I looked around the room. Stone walls, one window, shuttered, a shared washing basin in the corner. Not so different from Ashfen, really. Smaller, maybe. Colder. "First time in a royal castle?" Sarah asked. "First time outside my village." She made a sound that might have been sympathy or might have been resignation. It was hard to tell. "The work isn't terrible," she said at last, returning to her mending. "The castle is enormous, so mostly you're invisible. The nobility don't see us any more than they see the stones in the wall." She paused. "Just stay out of the west wing, and don't be caught in the great hall after the evening meal." "Because of the Alpha King." The woman Diel, who had not moved or spoken, said quietly to the ceiling, "Because of all of them." I did not ask what that meant. I put down my sack, lay back on the rustling pallet, and stared at the same ceiling Diel was staring at. Somewhere above us, in the layers of stone and tapestry and firelight that made up Castlemark's upper floors, the Alpha King lived and ruled and breathed. King Aidan of the Iron Blood line. I had heard his name spoken since childhood, the way people spoke of weather or fate, as something powerful, indifferent, and entirely beyond reach. I told myself it did not matter. I was here to work, to survive, to send coin back to what remained of my family in Ashfen. That was the whole of it. I fell asleep before I could convince myself I believed it. The first bell came before the sky had decided to be light. Sarah was already dressed when I startled awake, and she handed me a rough linen apron without comment. The twins moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this exact sequence of actions so many times it had become a kind of muscle memory. No wasted motion, no words. I followed them through the servants' corridors, up a back stair that smelled of old rushes, and into the upper east wing, where the morning's work began. My task that first morning was simple: clear the ashes from the hearths in the antechambers along the east corridor, and lay new fires before the castle woke. Sarah showed me once, quickly, and then left me to it. The work was quiet and solitary, and covered me in gray dust within the first quarter hour, and I found, unexpectedly, that I did not mind. There was something honest about ash. It asked nothing of you. It did not rank you. I was on the third hearth when I heard footsteps behind me. I moved to press myself against the wall the way Marta had instructed, eyes down. But the person who had entered was not dressed as a noble. He wore the plain, dark tunic and leather belt of a castle servant, carrying a tray of kindling as if he had been doing it all his life. Tall, though. Startlingly tall. With black hair braided back from a sharp-boned face, and eyes so pale a blue they looked almost silver in the corridor's torchlight. I looked away quickly, as habit demanded. But not before I noticed two things. First, his hands, wrapped around the kindling tray, bore old scars along the knuckles, the kind left not by kitchen work but by something harder and older. Second, when I had dropped my gaze, he had not moved on. He had stopped. And he was watching me with an expression I could not name, still and measuring, and entirely unlike the distracted glances servants exchanged in narrow corridors. "New?" he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "Yes, my lord." I caught myself. He was dressed as a servant. "Yes," I amended, uncertain now of the appropriate title. "Don't apologize for the instinct," he said, and there was something in his tone, dry, but not unkind. "You arrived yesterday?" "Last evening." He set the kindling tray down on the floor with a deliberateness that felt oddly formal, as though he were accustomed to things being placed exactly where he intended them. "How are the hearths along this corridor?" "Neglected," I said, before I could think better of it. "The ash in the third one hasn't been cleared in at least 3 days. The draft will be poor until the flue is properly swept." Something shifted in his expression. Not displeasure, something else. His eyes moved from my face to the hearth behind me, then back. "You know hearths," he said. "My father was a healer. We kept our own fires." A pause. Then very quietly. "Most new maids don't notice things like draft." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, and after a moment I turned back to the hearth, because the ash would not clear itself, and I had 2 more chambers to attend before the household woke. I heard him pick up the tray again, heard his footsteps move down the corridor. Not away, I realized. Further along, toward the next hearth. As if he intended to work this same corridor, this same morning. I told myself it meant nothing. A servant crossing paths with another servant. Nothing more. But my hands, I noticed, were no longer quite as steady as they had been, and the cold stone of the hearth felt somehow less cold than it had a moment before, By the time I finished my last chamber and carried the ash bucket back down to the lower yard, the sky had gone from black to the color of old pewter, and the castle was beginning to wake around me. Voices in distant corridors, the clang of the kitchen starting below, the measured tread of the dawn guard changing at the gates. I paused in the yard and breathed the morning air, gray and damp and smelling of hay and iron. For the first time since I had left Ashfen, the tightness in my chest loosened slightly. Then Sarah appeared at the yard door, and her face was not calm. "Nora," her voice was low, careful. "The man you spoke to in the east corridor this morning." She glanced behind her, as if measuring the distance to other ears. "Where exactly did you see him?" "The third antechamber. He was carrying kindling." Sarah went very still. "Did he speak to you?" "Briefly. We spoke of the hearths." She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. And when she opened them, the expression there was something I would think about for a long time afterward. "Nora," she said carefully, "that man does not work in this castle." The yard seemed to tilt slightly. "Then who—" "Come inside," Sarah said quietly, "before someone sees us standing here." She took my arm and drew me back through the door, and neither of us spoke again until we were in the depths of the servants' corridor with stone walls on all sides, and the morning clamor of the kitchen swallowing our voices whole. And even then, what she told me next made the ash bucket fall from my hand. "He is the Alpha King," Sarah said. 3 words, quiet as a candle being snuffed. I heard them. I understood them individually, each one a thing I knew the meaning of. And yet my mind refused to assemble them into a shape that made sense, the way you sometimes look at a familiar word written on parchment until it stops meaning anything at all. "That is not possible," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I have served in this castle for 11 years. Sarah's tone held no drama. That was what frightened me most. She was not whispering this as gossip. She was telling me a fact the way you tell someone the road ahead is washed out. Plainly, because they need to know before they take another step. I have seen King Aiden's face at every feast, every public assembly, every dawn inspection of the guard. I know his face the way I know this corridor." She paused. It was him. The ash bucket lay at my feet where I had dropped it, a small gray scatter of fine dust spreading across the stone floor. I stared at it because I needed somewhere to look that was not Sarah's careful, worried eyes. "He was carrying kindling," I said, aware of how foolish it sounded even as I said it. "Yes," said Sarah. "He spoke to me as though—" I stopped. As though what? As though we were equals. As though he were simply another servant navigating the same narrow corridor? Yes, exactly that. And I had answered him the same way. Had told him the hearths were neglected, had criticized the draft, had turned my back on him to return to my work. My stomach dropped somewhere beneath the castle floor. "Does he do this often?" I managed. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Around us, the kitchen sounds continued, the rhythm of the castle's morning utterly indifferent to the fact that my legs had become uncertain things. "There are stories," she said at last. "The senior maids speak of it sometimes, in low voices. That he walks the castle in plain clothes, unannounced. That he listens. Watches." She picked up the fallen ash bucket and pressed it back into my hands, a grounding gesture, whether it is a test or simply his nature. None of us have ever known for certain. A test. The word settled over me like cold water. I thought of everything I had said. Neglected. The draft will be poor until the flue is properly swept. I had said it plainly, without hesitation, to a man I assumed had no power over me, which meant I had said it, inadvertently, carelessly, to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. "What happens," I asked carefully, "to servants who fail his notice?" Sarah looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know that he tests them to punish them, Nora. but I have seen 3 maids removed from the East Corridor in the past year without explanation. She let that sit between us. Come. We have the morning linens to collect. She moved away down the corridor, and I followed, because there was nothing else to do. The castle did not pause for a maid's private reckoning. 2 days passed. I told myself to forget it. I threw myself into the work with the kind of focused ferocity that left no room for thought, clearing hearths, carrying linens, sweeping the stone floors of the antechambers with a broom whose handle was slightly too long for me, so that I had to compensate with my wrists, learning the rhythm of the bells that marked the castle's hours, memorizing which corridors led, where and which doors were never to be touched. The other maids began to warm to me by degrees. Dale, who had seemed distant that first night, turned out to speak quite freely once daylight came. She had a dry, precise sense of observation that I liked immediately. The twins, Bryn and Mel, communicated largely through a private shorthand of glances and small gestures that I slowly began to decode. They were kind in a practical way, the kind of kindness that showed up as sharing a heel of bread at midday, or warning you quietly that Marta was in a foul temper and to take the long way around the North Passage. On the 3rd morning, I was assigned the council anteroom for the first time. It was a larger chamber than the antechambers I had been working, higher ceilinged, with 2 great hearths facing each other across a long stone floor, and tall, narrow windows that looked out over the inner courtyard. The walls were hung with maps and the dark banners of the Ironblood line, and a heavy oak table ran the length of the room, its surface covered in scrolls and sealed documents that I was strictly forbidden to disturb. I worked quietly, efficiently. I cleared both hearths, laid the new fires, swept the floor in the methodical, overlapping strokes that Sarah had taught me. I was gathering the last of the dust into the collection cloth when the door at the far end of the room opened. I pressed myself to the wall immediately, eyes down. Footsteps. More than one person. 3, I thought, perhaps 4. The measured weight of them spoke of armored men, or at least men who carried themselves as armored men did even when they were not. The eastern border situation cannot wait past the new moon. A voice I did not recognize, sharp, impatient, alpha-ranked by the weight of authority in it. Lord Cavan's petition arrived this morning, and it directly contradicts what General Aldrich reported last week. Lord Cavan contradicts everyone. A second voice, calmer, slightly wry. It is his principal talent. His principal talent, said a third voice, is surviving despite it. That voice, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not raise itself because it had never needed to. I kept my eyes on the floor. The dustcloth was still in my hands. I was standing perhaps 8 feet from the table, pressed against the wall between the 2 hearths, and I was acutely, painfully aware that I was not invisible. I was simply being treated as though I were, which is a different thing entirely. "Leave us," said the third voice. The other footsteps departed. The door closed. And then there was silence, and I understood with a slow, sinking clarity that the command had been directed at the other 2 men, not at me, which meant I was still in the room, with him. I did not move. I did not breathe more than I had to. The fire I had just laid in the left hearth was beginning to catch, a quiet crackling that felt very loud in the sudden stillness. The fire draws well. I looked up before I could stop myself. He was standing at the far end of the table, not looking at the documents spread before him, but at the hearth I had just laid. King Aidan, because there was no pretending now, no distance of disbelief to hide behind. He wore dark traveling clothes rather than ceremonial armor, his black braids pulled back, and there was a faint tension in the line of his jaw that had not been there in the corridor 2 days ago. He looked, I thought, like a man who had received difficult news and had not yet decided what to do with it. He looked tired. "Thank you, Your Majesty," I said. My voice was steady. I did not know how. He turned then, and his pale blue eyes found me with that same still, measuring quality I remembered from the corridor, as if he were reading something written in a language most people couldn't see. "You were in the East Corridor," he said. not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. You told me the hearths were neglected. The words I had said came back to me with uncomfortable precision. I did, Your Majesty. I should not have. You were correct, he said. Silence. The flues in the east corridor have not been properly attended in some time, he continued, returning his gaze to the table as though he were simply noting a fact about the maps before him. I had the head of grounds confirm it yesterday. 3 of the 5 draft channels were partially blocked. A pause. You noticed that in your first morning. I did not know what to say, so I said, carefully, the fires in my father's house were my responsibility from the time I was old enough to manage them. You learn to see certain things. He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere in the courtyard below, a horse moved across the cobblestones, its hooves a rhythmic diminishing clatter. Why did you come to Castlemark? He asked. The question was so plain, so direct, that it caught me entirely off guard. Alphas, in my experience, did not ask Omegas that kind of question. They did not wonder why. They assigned, directed, dismissed. The wondering was a luxury not usually extended downward. My father passed last winter, I said. There was nothing left in Ashfin to hold me, and I needed work that would allow me to send coin home to my younger siblings. How many? 2, Your Majesty. A brother of 15 and a sister of 12. Something moved through his expression, brief, and gone too quickly to name. He looked back down at the documents before him, and his hand moved to one of the sealed scrolls, but did not open it. You may go, he said quietly. I gathered the dust cloth and the ash bucket, and crossed the room toward the servant's door with every step feeling slightly more significant than a step should feel. My hand was on the iron latch when his voice came again behind me. Nora. I stopped. The sound of my own name in that voice was a strange, disorienting thing. The hearth on the right, he said. You laid it slightly differently than the left, the wood stacked closer at the base. I turned, just slightly, to look back at him. The right hearth has a narrower throat, I said. A tighter stack draws better through a narrow opening. The left is wider. It needs air beneath. He looked at me for a long moment across the length of the room. Yes, he said. It does. I went through the door and stood in the servants' corridor, with my back against the closed oak, and my heart doing something entirely undignified against my ribs, and I thought, this man is testing something. I simply did not yet know what. That evening, Sarah found me in the linen room and leaned against the shelving with her arms crossed and an expression that mixed curiosity with careful worry. He asked Marta about you today, she said. I looked up from the folding. What? Directly, by name. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying me. In 11 years, Nora, I have never seen him ask about a maid by name. The linen in my hands was very still. What did he ask? Where you came from. What your father's trade was. She paused. Whether you intended to stay. The room felt suddenly smaller and warmer than it had a moment before. What did Marta tell him? The truth, I imagine. She doesn't know how to do anything else. Sarah unfolded her arms, pushed off the shelving, and paused at the door. Nora. Whatever is happening, be careful. Not because he seems dangerous, but because attention from that direction changes things. For everyone around you, not just yourself. She left, and I stood alone in the linen room with a folded sheet pressed between my hands, and the slow, uncomfortable understanding settling over me that the 4 days' walk from Ashfin had brought me somewhere considerably more complicated than I had intended to arrive. The following week arrived with rain, not the soft rain of Ashfin's fields, which fell in thin curtains and smelled of turned earth and wet herbs. This was castle rain, heavy, cold, hammering against the leaded glass of the high windows and running down the outer stones in dark rivulets, turning the inner courtyards into places of mud and wind and the acrid smell of soaked torches. The kind of rain that reminded people that the stones of a castle were, at their foundation, simply stones. I learned Castlemark the way you learn a new language, by immersion, by error, by repetition, until the patterns became instinct. I learned that Marta was more reasonable before the midday bell than after. I learned that the north corridor held a draught that cut like a blade near the broken arch window, and that the oldest maid, a white-haired woman named Etta, would complain if you swept toward her room, even if it was only stone dust, and there was no other direction to sweep in. I learned that Bryn, the quieter of the twins, was afraid of storms, and that Mel, the more talkative one, pretended not to notice so as not to embarrass her sister. I also learned, without intending to, as one learns most important things, the pattern of his movement through the castle. It was not something I sought. It was simply that Castlemark had rhythms, and the Alpha King was part of those rhythms, and the more time I spent in the corridors, the more I understood where and when those rhythms intersected. He crossed the inner courtyard before the morning bell, always alone, always on the same diagonal path that cut across the courtyard stones from the north tower to the map room. He ate late, and frequently did not eat at all. The guards outside the council chamber shifted position earlier on afternoons when he remained inside for extended periods, a different tension in their shoulders that I had learned to recognize. I should not have been noticing these things, but I noticed them. On the Thursday morning of the second week, I was in the council anteroom when I heard voices from inside the main chamber. The oak door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Normally, I would have finished my work and slipped out quietly. Instead, something in the quality of those voices held me in place. These were not the controlled voices of council deliberation. There was friction in them, the rough texture of men who disagreed and had not reached agreement. This is not a matter of opinion, my king. The hierarchy law is clear. An omega in a private corridor without a designated superior's supervision is a violation of chamber protocol. That voice I recognized. Lord Fenric, the senior counselor, a man of blonde hair threaded with white, whose presence in the castle seemed to exist exclusively to remind everyone of the rules that existed. Chamber protocol, said the king's voice. With that flat quality I was beginning to understand was more dangerous than any elevation of tone. Exists to protect council documents, not to regulate where a maid may sweep dust. The principle, your majesty. The principle, said the king, is that you are telling me how to manage my own castle. Silence. I had stopped breathing. She identified structural faults in the east corridor flue channels on her first day. The king continued, quieter now, which was somehow worse for anyone listening from outside. Faults that 3 maintenance supervisors had missed. I see no violation. I see competence. With respect, said Lord Fenric, and by his tone it was clear the respect was a calculated concession, not a felt one. The competence of an omega in domestic maintenance is not grounds to ignore. You are dismissed, Fenric. A pause. Then footsteps, heavy, controlled, and the door opened fully. I was standing in the middle of the anteroom with a floor brush in my hands like an accusation, and Lord Fenric passed me without looking at me directly. But the peripheral glance he cast contained something I recognized instinctively. It was not contempt. It was something colder than contempt. It was a warning. That evening in the maid's room, Diel was sitting on the edge of my pallet with her legs crossed and the look of someone who had been thinking for a long time about something she was now ready to say. Fenric spoke with Marta, she said, without preamble. Bryn and Mel exchanged a quick glance from their pallets. Sarah continued sewing without lifting her eyes, but the set of her shoulders shifted slightly. What did he say? I asked. That you were in a restricted corridor without supervision, that it represented a matter of protocol. Diel tilted her head. Marta said you had been assigned to work that corridor, which is true. Then there is no violation. There is no documentable violation, said Diel, with a precision that told me she had considered legal distinctions before. That is different. Sarah finally looked up from her sewing. Fenric won't file a formal complaint. He's too shrewd for that now that the king has spoken. But he will watch. And he will wait. Wait for what? I asked, though part of me already knew. For a mistake, said Mel simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. It's always that way. You don't knock down someone who is standing. You wait for them to stumble. The room was quiet for a moment. The rain continued outside, striking the window ledge in irregular gusts. Why would he care so much? I asked slowly. About a maid. No one answered immediately. Then Dal said, in that flat voice she used when being very careful, "It isn't you he cares about." I understood then. It was not about me. It had never been about me. It was about the fact that the king had asked for my name. The following morning, the weather had cleared to a crystalline cold with low sun coming through the east windows at sharp golden angles, illuminating dust in the air that would otherwise be invisible. I went to the east corridor earlier than usual. I wanted to finish the hearths before the morning traffic began. He was there, not with a kindling tray this time. He was simply standing near the arch window at the end of the corridor, his back to me, looking down into the courtyard below. He wore dark clothes again, plain leather breeches and a simple shirt, without the ceremonial weight of council robes. His braid was slightly undone, as if he had woken too early for anyone to redo it, or simply did not care. He heard my footsteps. Of course he did. He was Alpha. His perception was another order of thing entirely. But he did not turn immediately. I should have continued past, should have pressed myself to the wall, eyes down, and waited for him to move or leave. Instead, I began working on the first hearth, because the ash would not wait, and because something in the set of his shoulders against that window told me, without words, that he was not there in search of protocol. "You wake early," he said finally, without turning. "The work begins early, Your Majesty. That is not what I asked." I paused with the brush. "I have always woken early," I said. "In Ashven, my father's patients sometimes arrived before dawn. I learned not to wait for the day to wake me." Now he turned. The low morning sun struck his face at an angle that revealed the line of a scar I had not noticed before. Narrow, old, running from his left temple down to the jaw, partially hidden by his short beard. It was not disfiguring. It was simply part of him, the way certain marks become so integrated into a face that you cannot imagine that face without them. "Your father was a healer," he said. "He was. And you assisted in his work." It was not a question, so I did not answer it as one. "Since I was old enough to tie a bandage knot," I said, returning to the hearth. "He used to say that idle hands in a healing house were the greatest possible waste." Silence. Then something I did not expect. He was right. I looked up. He was watching the courtyard again, but something was different now in his posture. A very slight release in the shoulders, like a tension that had decided provisionally to rest. "There is a man in the guards' quarters," he said, and the change of subject was so abrupt that I blinked. "Garrison, captain of the North Guard. He took a fall during training 2 days ago. The castle healer treated the knee, but Garrison says the poultice he was given smells of rot and burns more than it should." I looked at him. "You are telling me this because you know poultices," he said simply. The directness of it was so complete that it almost made me laugh. Not from disrespect, but the kind of laughter that escapes when something surprises you entirely. "Your Majesty, I am a maid, not a healer. You said you assisted your father since you were old enough to tie a bandage knot. Assisting is not the same as Nora." He said my name the same way he had said it in the corridor on the first morning, quiet, direct, without ornament. "I am not asking you to perform surgery. I am asking whether you can identify a spoiled poultice." A pause. "Yes," I said slowly. "That I can do." Something that might have been the furthest edge of a smile passed the corner of his mouth. Not pronounced enough to be called a smile. but enough for me to notice. "The guards' quarters are north of the smithy," he said. "Garrison is a large man with a worse temper. Tell him the king sent you." He turned to leave, and I remained kneeling before the hearth with the brush still in my hand, and the sense that the corridor had changed size somehow, grown smaller or larger, I could not say which. "Your Majesty," I called, before I could think better of it. He stopped. "The hearth at the arch," I said. "It smokes when the wind comes from the northeast because there is a crack in the inner deflector. Someone mortared over it instead of replacing the stone. It will hold another winter, perhaps 2. After that, it will be a problem." A pause. "You noticed that when?" he said. "First morning." This time the silence lasted longer. Then he said, without turning, "Write a report. Deliver it to the head of maintenance under my name." And he was gone down the corridor, his footsteps quiet and even, and I stared at the floor stones for a long moment before I realized I was smiling at nothing, without intention, without adequate reason, as if something inside me had decided to do it on its own. That afternoon I went to the guards' quarters. Garrison was indeed a very large man with a temper precisely as poor as the king had described. He looked at me when I entered the way a man looks at an inconvenience the size of an insect, until I smelled the poultice. "This has old wormwood mixed with fermented cabbage stalk," I said, unable to fully conceal my expression. Garrison frowned. "The healer Aldous prepared it." Aldous put old wormwood on a joint inflammation. I looked at him. Fresh wormwood has merit. Wormwood past its use has the opposite effect. It irritates tissue instead of calming it. And fermented cabbage stalk serves no therapeutic purpose I am aware of beyond smelling unpleasant. Garrison stared at me. "How old are you?" he said at last. 23, and I learned poultices before I learned to read. I met his eyes. "I need clean water. Comfrey leaves if there are any in the herb garden, and white clay. If there is no clay, filtered mud will serve." He stared at me for another long moment. Then he called one of the younger guards by name and told him to fetch the things. When I finished, and the captain's knee was wrapped in a poultice that smelled of earth and herbs rather than rot, the man was quiet for an unusual moment. Then he said, with the air of someone revising an opinion they had formed too quickly, "Where did you learn that?" "From my father," I said, cleaning my hands. "Was he a good healer?" "He was the best I have known." Garrison nodded slowly, deliberately. "Thank you," he said at last, as though the word were an unfamiliar object in his mouth. I walked back through the castle corridors with the smell of comfrey on my hands, and something it took me a while to name warming the center of my chest. It was not pride, exactly. It was older than pride. It was the feeling of being useful in a way that mattered, not simply moving ash from one place to another, but bringing something that only I knew how to bring. My father had told me once, while I watched him treat a boy's leg after a fall from a tree, "Nora, the knowledge you carry is not yours. It is borrowed from every person you will one day help." I had forgotten, in the gray months after his passing, that I still carried that debt. That night, the castle felt a little less cold. The report about the arch hearth deflector was delivered to the head of maintenance the following morning. I had written it by candlelight the night before, sitting on the edge of my pallet while the other maids slept, scratching the words carefully onto a scrap of parchment that Sarah had found for me in the linen storage. She had not asked what I needed it for, which was either discretion or wisdom, and I was grateful for either. I described the crack, the location, the likely cause, the approximate timeline before it would require full replacement. I wrote it the way my father had taught me to document a patient's condition, plainly, completely, without embellishment, because the facts themselves were the thing. I signed it Nora of Ashfin, East Corridor, and felt briefly like an absolute fool. The head of maintenance, a barrel-shaped man named Corvin with permanently ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone perpetually behind on something, read it twice without speaking. Then he looked at me over the top of the parchment. "You wrote this?" Yes. You're the new maid. Yes. He looked at the parchment again. Then he set it down on his work table with the deliberate care of a man filing something he intended to act on, rather than lose. The king's name is on this. He asked me to deliver it under his name. Yes. Corvin studied me for a moment. With the eyes of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had already fully mapped. Then he simply said, "I'll send a mason to look at it this week." I thanked him and left. It was a small thing. A crack in a stone deflector, a report on a scrap of parchment, a mason who would be sent to look at it. Nothing of consequence to anyone in the castle except possibly the people who used that hearth in winter. But walking back through the corridor, I felt, for reasons I could not entirely justify, that I had done something that mattered. Captain Garrison found me 3 days later. I was in the outer corridor near the Great Hall, carrying a stack of folded linen to the upper chambers, when I heard heavy footsteps behind me and turned to find him there, all of him, which was considerable. He was walking without a noticeable limp, which I noted before anything else. "The knee," I said, because it seemed the relevant thing. "Better," he said, in the tone of a man who found admissions of improvement mildly inconvenient. He fell into step beside me, which was unusual enough that 2 passing servants glanced at us sidelong. A captain of the guard walking beside a maid with linen was not a common sight. Aldous came to redress it yesterday. I told him the new poultice was working and to leave it alone. Did he? He did not seem pleased. I imagine not. I shifted the linen stack in my arms. The comfrey should be changed every 2 days until the swelling fully reduces. After that, gentle movement is better than rest. Garrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where are you from?" "Ashfin, South Lowlands. Long way. 4 days on foot." He made a sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite acknowledgement, but landed somewhere between them. We reached the foot of the stairs and I stopped, because he clearly had not come all this way simply to discuss his knee. "The king asked about you again," Garrison said. I kept my expression even. "What did he ask?" "Whether you had come to the guards' quarters, whether the treatment worked." He paused. "Whether you seemed well." That last part landed quietly, like a stone dropped into still water, the kind that made almost no sound but sent ripples that reached much further than you expected. "Whether you seemed well." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That you knew what you were doing and weren't afraid to say so." Garrison's expression was difficult to read, weathered and composed, the face of a man who had learned long ago that most situations required less reaction than they provoked. That is not a common combination in this castle, in my experience. He turned and walked back the way he had come, and I stood at the foot of the stairs with the linen against my chest, and the distinct sensation that the castle was rearranging itself around me in ways I had not chosen and could not fully see. The tension came to a head on a gray afternoon 10 days into my 3rd week. I was in the great hall early, before the evening gathering, sweeping the rushes near the far end, where the lesser servants took their meals. The hall was largely empty at that hour, a few stable hands on the benches near the door, 2 junior guards playing a dice game in the corner. The great hearth at the hall's center was lit against the autumn cold, and the light it threw was warm and orange and made the stone walls look almost soft. I did not hear Lord Fenric enter. I only became aware of him when I looked up and found him standing perhaps 10 feet away, watching me with that same cold, peripheral quality he had shown in the corridor outside the council chamber. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, both bearing the marks of minor noble rank, both watching me with expressions calibrated to indifference in the way that things carefully calibrated to appear indifferent usually are not. "The Ashfen girl," said Fenric. I straightened. "My lord, I understand you've been making yourself rather useful." His tone was pleasant. The pleasantness was a coat over something else entirely. Reporting on the castle's maintenance, treating the guard captain's injuries, writing things down under the king's name. "The king asked me to deliver a report, my lord," I did so. Of course. He clasped his hands behind his back and took a slow step to the side. Not toward me, simply sideways. The way a man moves when he is making a point about the space he occupies. You are an Omega from a lowland village, correct? No formal training, no designation, no family connection to this court. That is correct, my lord. Then I wonder, he said, with the gentle, musing tone of someone who does not wonder at all, how a girl in your position comes to be doing the work of a trained maintenance scribe and a castle healer within 3 weeks of her arrival. The stable hands near the door had gone very still. The dice game in the corner had stopped. I did not do the work of either, I said, keeping my voice even. I reported what I observed and I dressed a wound. Both are things my father taught me. Neither requires formal designation. Fenric smiled. It did not reach any part of his face above his mouth. Your father, he said. A village healer. A good man, I am sure. But village healers do not train scribes or council aides, do they? They train daughters to be useful in small ways in small places. He paused, letting that settle. This is not a small place. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, wind moved against the high windows. No, I agreed quietly. It is not. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of surprise, brief and quickly controlled, that I had not argued the point further. Perhaps he had expected me to apologize, to look at the floor, to become smaller. I was very familiar with the expectation that I should become smaller. My lord, the voice came from the entrance of the great hall, and every person in the room, including Fenric, went still in the particular way people go still when a presence enters that outranks everyone present. I did not need to look to know who it was, but I looked anyway. King Aidan stood at the hall's entrance in his traveling clothes. He had apparently come directly from somewhere, his dark cloak still carrying the cold of outside, his pale blue eyes taking in the tableau of the hall with an expression that revealed nothing and somehow communicated everything. He looked at Fenric, then, briefly, at me. I did not know there was a gathering in the great hall this evening, he said pleasantly. Fenric turned, and whatever calculation he had been performing visibly shifted. My king, we were simply conversing with my maid. The king moved further into the hall, unhurried, and the space reorganized itself around him the way spaces always did. About small places and large ones, if I heard correctly. The silence had weight to it. Nora, the king said, without looking at me now, his attention still on Fenric with that still, measuring quality. Have you finished the evening hearths? Not yet, your majesty. I was attending the hall first. Attend the hearths. A pause. The arch hearth in the east corridor has been repaired, as it happens. The mason finished this afternoon. You may want to test the draw before morning. It was a dismissal, but not the kind that diminished. It was the kind that moved you out of the path of something before it could reach you. Yes, your majesty. I gathered my things and walked toward the servants' exit, and I did not look at Fenric as I passed him. But I heard, in the quiet of the hall behind me, the king begin to speak to the counselor in a voice that had dropped several degrees in temperature, and even through the stone of the closing door, I could feel the quality of what was being said, even without the words. In the east corridor, I knelt before the repaired hearth and lit a small taper to test the draw. The smoke rose clean and straight. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a long moment. That thin, clean line of smoke, going exactly where it was supposed to go. And something in my chest loosened in a way that had nothing to do with the hearth. Sarah was waiting when I returned to the maid's room. Not waiting the way she sometimes did, the casual waiting of someone who happened to be present. She was sitting on her pallet with her hands in her lap, and a stillness that told me she had news she had been holding for a while. Sit down, she said. I sat. Mardo was summoned to the king's study this afternoon, Sarah said, before the great hall, before whatever just happened in there. She looked at me steadily, He told her that your duties are to be reassigned. The word reassigned hit me somewhere unsteady. To what? I asked. You are no longer assigned to general corridor cleaning. Sarah paused. You have been given the position of personal chambermaid to the council wing. It is a senior designation. Etta held it for 6 years before her hands gave out. Another pause. It means your work takes you through the inner council chambers every day. It means you answer directly to Marta and to no one below the king himself. I stared at her. That is not a normal reassignment, I said. No, agreed Sarah. It is not. Diel, from her pallet, said quietly to the ceiling. He is watching something. He wants to see what you do when the walls get closer. I thought about that for a long time in the dark after the candles were out. The walls getting closer, the space narrowing, the attention of very powerful people sharpening around something as small and unremarkable as me. My father's voice came to me in the dark, unhurried and warm. The ones who notice everything quietly are the most dangerous people in any room, Nora. Not because they intend harm, but because nothing escapes them. I had thought he was talking about healers. Lying in the dark in Castlemark with the cold coming through the shuttered window and the sounds of the castle settling around me, I wondered, for the first time, if he had been talking about me. Winter arrived at Castlemark, the way difficult truths arrive. Not all at once, but in increments, each one slightly colder than the last, until one morning you woke, and the world outside the window was white, and the cold had become simply the condition of everything. I had been in the castle 7 weeks. In that time I had learned the council wing the way I had once learned my father's healing room. Every stone, every draft, every hinge that needed oil, and every window latch that stuck in damp weather. I knew which counselors took their morning meal early, and which ones did not take it at all. I knew that Lord Fenrick's aide arrived before his master every morning, and spent the intervening time reading documents he was not supposed to be reading. I filed that observation away without knowing yet what to do with it. I knew that the king worked late. Later than anyone else in the castle. Later than the guards who changed at midnight. Later than the kitchen servants banking the fires before sleep. I knew this because the light under the door of his private study was the last light I saw when I made my final round of the corridor each night, checking that the evening fires were properly set and the council chambers were in order for morning. I had not spoken to him privately since the morning in the East Corridor when he had sent me to garrison. But I was aware of him in the way you are aware of weather, not always looking at it directly, but always knowing where it was. The thing that changed everything happened on a Wednesday, in the deepest part of a winter night. I was making my final corridor round when I noticed that the light under the king's study door was not the steady amber of candlelight. It was moving, flickering in a way that candlelight did not flicker, orange and sharp and wrong. I did not think. I pushed open the door. A small brazier near the window had tipped, knocked perhaps by the wind that had come through the casement left slightly ajar, or perhaps simply unbalanced on the uneven hearthstone. The coals inside had spilled onto a stack of documents on the floor beside it, and the parchment was burning with the quick, hungry enthusiasm of old dry paper. The king was on the other side of the room, his back turned, apparently having not yet registered what had happened behind him. I crossed the room, seized the water basin from the side table, and poured it directly onto the burning documents before the fire could reach the wall tapestry above them. The sound of it, the hiss and the steam and the sudden darkness where the orange had been, made the king turn sharply. The room smelled of wet ash and scorched parchment. A thin curl of smoke drifted toward the ceiling. I was standing over the ruin of what had been, a moment ago, a small fire, with an empty basin in my hands and the water soaking into the hearthstone around my feet. The silence stretched. The brazier tipped, I said, because something needed to be said. The casement was open. I saw the light changing under the door. He looked at the scorched documents, then at me, then at the open casement, which was indeed letting in a thin ribbon of winter air. He crossed to it and pushed it firmly shut, "How much is damaged?" he asked, crouching to examine what remained of the parchment. I crouched beside him, realizing only after I had done it that this was not a thing a maid typically did, crouched beside the Alpha King to assess damage to council documents, and looked at the papers. The edges of 3 pages were gone. The center of one was partially legible. "The outer sheets are lost," I said. "The ones beneath are scorched at the margins, but the writing is mostly intact." I carefully lifted the top damaged page. "This one is still readable if the ink did not run. Parchment holds text better than paper in water. The ink sits differently in the grain." He was very still beside me. "You know about parchment," he said. "My father kept records of every patient he treated. He was particular about parchment versus paper, and when to use each." I set the page down gently. "If you have a dry cloth and a warm surface, you can flatten and dry the salvageable pages before the dampness sets the distortion permanently. They will wrinkle at the edges, but the content will survive." Another silence. Longer this time. "Nora." I looked up. He was watching me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not the measuring quality of the corridors, not the careful blankness of the council hall. Something more unguarded than either. Something that looked in the unsteady light of the single remaining candle, almost like the expression of a man who had been alone for a very long time and had just, unexpectedly, felt less so. "Why did you come to Castlemark?" he asked. I blinked. "You asked me that before, Your Majesty, in the council anteroom." "I know," he said. "I am asking again." I looked at the damaged documents between us and thought about Ashvin, about the 4 days walking, about the wool sack and the letter, and the empty healer's room with its dried herbs still hanging from the rafters. "Because there was nothing left there that needed me," I said at last, honestly. "And I thought that if I went somewhere large enough, there might be something that did." The candle between us moved in some unfelt current of air. "And is there?" he asked quietly. The question was simple. It was also not simple at all. "Yes," I said. "I think there is." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached past me and carefully lifted the stack of salvageable documents, and rose, and set them on the work table in a precise, deliberate arrangement. He found a dry cloth in the table drawer and spread it beneath them without being told. He had listened. He had remembered what I said. I rose and picked up the empty basin and thought, this is who he is when no one is performing for him. Not the king the court saw, deliberate and unreachable. Not the figure in the council chamber whose silences carried the weight of law. This, moving quietly through a room at midnight, salvaging wet documents, not calling for servants because it had not occurred to him to call for servants. This was the actual man. And the actual man was someone I was in considerable danger of caring about. I left the study and I did not sleep. I lay on my pallet in the dark and listened to Diel's quiet breathing and Sarah's steady exhale and the wind against the castle walls, and I made myself think clearly, which was difficult because my thoughts kept returning to a specific quality of stillness in a candlelit room. He was the Alpha King. I was an Omega maid from a village that most people at this court had never heard of. The distance between those two facts was not a distance that could be walked across, not even in 7 weeks, not even with scorched documents and comfrey poultices and reports about deflector cracks delivered under his name. And yet, he had asked me twice why I came here. He had sent me to garrison. He had spoken my name in corridors and summoned Marta and reassigned my duties and stood in the great hall and reduced Fenrick's pleasant threat to ash with 3 sentences and a drop in room temperature. I did not know what to call the shape of all of that, but I knew it was a shape. It was not nothing. 3 days later, garrison found me again, this time deliberately, in the herb garden off the south courtyard, where I had gone on my half-day rest to look at what remained of the winter stores of comfrey and dried yarrow. He stood at the garden gate with his arms crossed, and that expression of a man conducting an internal negotiation. "He asked me," Garrison said without introduction, "whether I thought you were content here." I looked up from the dried herb bundles. "What did you tell him?" "That you seemed to be a person who made herself content by being useful, and that this was not the same thing as being happy." He paused. "I may have overstepped. You may have been accurate." He looked at me for a moment. "He is not an easy man," he said. "I have served him for 9 years. He does not ask about people as a rule. He observes them, draws his own conclusions, acts on them without explanation." A pause. "He has been asking about you since the 3rd morning you were here." The winter garden was very quiet. "Garrison," I said carefully, "why are you telling me this?" The captain was silent for a long moment, the wind moving through the bare branches of the garden's single dormant apple tree above us. "Because I have watched him carry the weight of this kingdom alone for 9 years, he said at last simply. "And because you make him ask questions instead of simply deciding. That is rarer than you know." He left, and I stood in the cold garden, with dried comfrey between my fingers, and the weight of something I could not name, settling slowly and permanently somewhere in my chest. He came to the council wing himself that evening, not at midnight, and not in plain clothes. He came at the hour before the evening meal in his full council attire, dark, formal leather, the iron clasp at his shoulder that bore the iron blood seal. And he walked the length of the corridor until he reached the window where I was checking the latch that stuck in cold weather, and he stopped. "It sticks," I said, without turning, because I had heard his footsteps, and there was no longer any point in pretending I did not know them. "It has stuck for 3 winters," he said. "The iron has expanded in the frame. It needs to be reset, not forced." I worked the latch carefully until it gave. "There." Silence. "Nora." His voice was different from all the other times, not flat, not careful, not the voice of a man managing a distance he had chosen to keep. "I owe you a truthful thing." I turned then. He was standing in the corridor with the evening light from the far window behind him, and he looked not tired, exactly. He looked like a man who had decided something, and was now following the decision to where it led, regardless of where that was. "The disguise," he said. "The mornings in the east corridor. I have done this before. Walked the castle in plain clothes to hear what is true rather than what people perform for me." He paused. "But I want you to know that what began as habit became something else. I was not testing you after the 1st morning. After the 1st morning, I was simply—" He stopped. Began again. "I was looking for reasons to be in the same corridor." The window latch was cold under my fingers. "That is a very honest thing," I said. "You make me want to be honest," he said. "I find I am not entirely accustomed to the sensation." Outside the window, the courtyard was filling with the blue shadow of early winter evening, the torches being lit one by one along the outer wall, small fires against the dark. "I do not know what this is," I said carefully, because he deserved my honesty in return. "I know what I am and what you are, and I know that those 2 things do not usually—" "No," he agreed, "they do not." "But," I said. "But," he said. The word sat between us, small and enormous. "I would like," he said quietly, "to stop pretending that I am in this corridor for any reason other than the one that is actually true, if you will allow it." I looked at him. The scar along his jaw, the pale blue eyes that saw everything and revealed so little unless you had learned, as I slowly had, exactly where to look. The man who ate late and worked past midnight and had not called for servants when his documents caught fire. The man who asked Garrison whether I seemed happy. "I will allow it," I said. What followed was not a swift thing. It was not a declaration in the great hall, or a sudden transformation in the eyes of the court. It was slower than that, and realer than that, and built from the same materials everything between us had always been built from, Small observations, honest words, the shared language of people who paid attention to things others overlooked. Fenric resigned from the council 2 weeks later, citing personal matters. Garrison told me, privately, that the king had presented him with documentation of his aide's unauthorized document access. Evidence that had, apparently, been quietly accumulating for some time. Corvin, the maintenance head, sent word that the East Corridor flue repairs were complete. The arch-hearth drew clean all winter. I remained in the castle, not as chambermaid to the council wing. That changed in the early weeks of the new year, when Marta came to me with an expression of someone delivering news she found both startling and, on reflection, fitting. The king had requested a position be created. There was no existing title for it exactly, something between a castle steward's role and a keeper of internal affairs. Someone who moved through the castle and noticed things and reported them honestly and knew a spoiled poultice from a sound one and could write a clear report about a cracked deflector and had, it appeared, the particular and uncommon quality of seeing what was actually true rather than what people chose to show. I asked Marta what the title would be. She looked at me with that flat, wise expression that I had come to understand concealed a great deal of dry warmth. "The king says you may name it yourself," she said. "He says you have earned that." Sarah cried when I told her, which she immediately denied, and then cried again. Dale said, to the ceiling, that she had known from the third morning, which may have been true. The twins brought me bread and honey from the kitchens, and sat on my pallet talking until past the midnight bell, which was the most either of them had ever said to me at once, and I understood that this was their way of saying something they did not have words for. Garrison shook my hand in the courtyard the following morning, formal as a military exchange, and then stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Your father," he said finally, "would have been pleased." I looked at him and felt the familiar ache of that loss, but beneath it, for the first time in a long time, something that was not grief. Something that was the other side of grief, the part that comes after. "Yes," I said. "I think he would have." Spring arrived eventually, as it always does, tentative at first, then certain. The cold withdrawing from the stones, the way a held breath finally releases. The courtyard apple tree in the herb garden put out its first pale blossoms in late March, and I noticed them on a morning when I was crossing the courtyard with a written account of 3 maintenance concerns for Corvin's attention and a poultice recipe for the junior guard who had sprained his wrist at training. I stopped and looked at the blossoms for a moment. Behind me I heard footsteps I knew. Their particular unhurried weight, their even spacing. "The tree bloomed early," he said, coming to stand beside me. "The south-facing wall holds heat," I said. "It shelters it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pale blossoms against the gray stone wall. Then he said simply, "Are you content here, Nora?" I thought of Garrison's words in this same garden in winter. Content by being useful is not the same as happy. "I am happy," I said, which was a different answer, and he knew it, and I knew that he knew it. His hand found mine, briefly, warmly, the way people reach for something they have decided to stop pretending they do not want. The blossoms moved slightly in the morning air. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left that needed saying. The castle went on around us, the bells marking the hours, the guards at their posts, the fires drawing clean in the repaired hearths, the rhythms of a place that had become, without my entirely choosing it, mine. I had walked 4 days to find somewhere that needed me. I had not expected to find in the same place someone who simply, quietly, honestly, without performance or pretense, wanted me to stay. But I stayed. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything.